Madam President, I rise to support this appropriation bill and to discuss the schedule to it, that is the estimates of Barbados. Madam President, I've had the honour of sitting in this honourable chamber for 6 years, but this is actually my 7th discussion of estimates because of the timing of the estimates on this historic occasion. I would like to begin with some congratulations, Madam President, on some of the things that were said yesterday, although all of the honourable senators are not here, but there were things that were said that I really would like to comment on. I would like to congratulate my friend Senator Worrell for his comments about restoring the productivity of the plantations, particularly those of my birthplace, the Republic of St. John. When I drive through St. John, I'm still hailed by all the people who can remember me and my parents work in St. John. And I'm always close to tears as I see the bush, the weed, the cowage, and the River Tamarind that has taken over those formerly fertile plantations, because the plantations of St. John were the plantations which used to win the prizes for sugarcane at the annual agricultural exhibition in Queen's Park, for example, and most of them are now in bush. It makes me extremely sad. So I thank Senator Worrell profoundly for bringing this huge problem for what some people call the neglected parish of St. John, my birthplace, to the attention of the Senate and to the public. I would also like to congratulate Senator Sandiford Garner for the brilliant comments, the very lucid comments that she made about parenting, or the poor parenting of Barbados, and the desperate need for improving parenting, for educating, teaching, training, helping, supporting parents in terms of the child raising, which has led to the social problems among some of our young people in Barbados. In spite of the brilliant opportunities and the brilliant performance of many of them, both in sport, academia, and other extracurricular activities, the fact is that many of our young people are falling through the net. Many of them are leaving school unable to be truly literate. Many of them are leaving school with no qualifications for the outside world. And that leads to the other issue of the nature of our education. I think on the first point, Senator Sandiford Garner's point about parenting, we've had the example initiated by the late Sir Arthur Graham, known to most of us as Dr. Bertie Graham, with his brilliant work in producing the Children's Development Center, but also in initiating Parados. Now, Parados has done a glorious job, but Parados just isn't big enough. Parados does not reach out to the whole society. Parados needs to replicate, whether by binary fission or other more prominent viral expansion, to use the common IT term. Parados needs to be replicated across the country of Barbados, because as the late colleague of mine, Professor George Nicholson said, we have a society with children bearing children and children raising children. Madam President, the statistics for teenage pregnancies have not much improved since the days when we had a continuing medical education conference on adolescent problems, and the fact of children bearing children is an enormous one, because it leads, for perhaps historical reasons and modern sociological changes, it leads to single parent homes, and those adolescents who would have born children when they were still in school or when they were not working as young people used to have a grandmother at home looking after them. That situation has changed. The old village community has changed. Society has changed. But we have inherited a problem, which, as was said yesterday, it's one of those problems that we should try to change. We have inherited a problem of very young people having to raise children, which they have by accident and not by intention, and without the support necessary. So, Madam President, this issue of child raising and parenting that Senator Sandiford Garner raised is one that requires a massive effort, a massive national effort to support it. And I'm not seeing that it has been contemplated in any of the changes in our estimates in relation to the relevant resources that we would need to do so, or to the relevant ministries that would look after that, either youth, education, or social care, all of which would be stakeholders in something like that. I would also wish to comment on Senator Sandiford Garner's comment about the need for more tourist attractions. A few years ago, in response to some comment like that in the press, I wrote one of my columns of 50 things to do in Barbados. And I would be prepared to bet that most of us, far less most of our visitors, have not sampled many of those 50 things to do, because they do include 22 museums, which is the number we've reached with the opening of the Exchange Museum, the old Masonic Lodge which the Central Bank has created, and which the Barbados Museum has been consulting with to create a magnificent museum. It was officially opened some time ago, but because of various bureaucratic issues, it has not been finally reopened to the public, and that should happen within a matter of a few weeks, certainly before Easter. And that would be our Barbados Museum number 22. We have experiences that people would not have seen anywhere else in the world. We have one of a small number of Concord museums. That in itself is a fabulous experience. We have a splendid Malaloo Motor Museum for those interested in cars and classic cars. We have the museum at Springvale, Mr. Greenidge's museum of the folk history of Barbados. And I won't ask, as I often do with an audience, for a show of hands of those who have seen the magnificent Springvale Folk Museum. But many people that I know have not gone there. There are 22 museums in Barbados, Madam President. And so that brings us to the issue of tourism and product development. But I won't go there just yet. I would like to congratulate, Madam President, Senator DePisa for her comment about family life education in schools. This is something in which I played a role somewhat when the Chronic Disease Research Center began, and our work on the obesity in children recognized with the discussions in the schools what were two major problems. One was the issue of family life education, civics and ethics. I do apologize for this, Madam President. I'm sorry, I'll have to put that off. Please forgive me. And those issues were discussed along with the issues of physical activity and sport. Because what we discovered at that time among our young children was that because of the pressures on the curriculum, physical activity, PT as it used to be called, gym workouts and competitive team sports had been relegated to a very small proportion of the school curriculum and extracurriculum in the schools. And this was something I had many long discussions with both the physical education teachers and the Ministry of Education some 18, 20 years ago. So I'm delighted to hear from Senator DePisa that family life education is being taught right through until the third form. That is a worthwhile activity, and I wonder, I am now stimulated by Senator DePisa to research what the curriculum actually is and how it is being done. I also congratulate Senator DePisa on bringing to the attention of the public and honorable senators the issue related to kidney transplants, because there are many things that have happened at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital led by the doctors. I say that without fear of contradiction. And the kidney transplant, the first one done in Barbados, was done by Professor Waldron. I thought I'd put this right off, Madam President. I do apologize. Maybe I should throw it into the bin. Some 30 years ago, I think, Professor Sir Errol Walrond carried out the first kidney transplant in Barbados, but the administrative support to make that a continuing success was a very major problem, and the health promotion requirement to persuade Barbadians that they should sign the appropriate documents to make kidneys available on their sudden passing if they had an accident, that kind of education and health promotion was just not available, and the program fell through. But in fact, the program of kidney transplantation started under the leadership of Dr. Margaret O'Shea some 2 years ago in 2016, and about half a dozen kidney transplants have been done over time, and it is done with the assistance of a charity which I think is called Transplant Link Charity. And this provides both some funding and technical support from Britain, as well as local charitable funding, philanthropy, once again including people like the Maria Holder Trust, I believe, the Peter Moore's Foundation, and so on. So again, it is an advance which has been led by philanthropy. And although it was said yesterday that philanthropy is alive and well, I wish it was alive and a great deal stronger, because we read about philanthropy to the universities over and away, and the gifts given by the wealthy donors to universities like Harvard, Yale, even Aberdeen, where my wife graduated, tend to be million-dollar donations. We don't tend to get million-dollar donations. We tend to get rather more modest donations. But I thank Senator De Pisa for highlighting this issue of kidney transplant, because we have been not very successful, and that is a laitoti, Madam President. We have been not very successful in our promotion to prevent the chronic diseases of diabetes and hypertension, the combination of which lead to kidney failure, and therefore we should reduce the huge dialysis costs by increasing the number of transplant patients. And so I personally congratulate Dr. O'Shea for her work in getting this program back on stream over the last 2 years. And then, Madam President, I congratulate Senator Carmichael for his address yesterday, in which he mentioned the area of huge potential which the Reverend Patrick Tanis has been promoting along with me for the last several years, and that of religious tourism. I like to think of it to a large extent as cathedral tourism, because people go to the great cathedrals of the world, and while entry to our St. Michael's and All Angels Cathedral is entirely free for that magnificent cathedral and churchyard, when you go to the great cathedrals of Europe, you are invited to pay a modest subscription. You are invited, and you do pay, and you do not go in unless you pay that usually 5, 6, or 10 pounds, or the equivalent, to see these cathedrals. And the St. Michael's and All Angels Cathedral has a tremendous amount of both architectural history, monumental history, and so on, icons. And I'm reminded, of course, Madam President, I'm sorry that the Honorable Dean Harold Critchlow is not here to give his blessing on this story, but there is a story, perhaps apocryphal, of the tourist who was visiting cathedrals of the world. And he visited Notre Dame in Paris, and by the door of the cathedral, he saw a magnificent silver telephone. And he asked the verger, "What is that for?" And the verger said, "Ah, that is for speaking to God. The price is 1,000,000 francs. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't afford it, but I would love to speak to God." He went to Rome, to St. Peter's, where there was a golden phone by the door of St. Peter's, and he said to the verger, "What is that for?" And the verger said, "Oh, that is for speaking to God, and the cost is 2,000,000 lira." But he hadn't got it on him. His next stop was Barbados. He entered St. Michael's and All Angels Cathedral, where there was one of those old black rotary dial phones on a little shelf next to the telephone, next to the door, and he asked the verger, "What is that for?" And the verger said, "That is to phone God. You can phone any time." And he said, "And how much will it cost?" And he said, "Oh, it don't cost nothing." And the tourist said, "But how come? It's 1,000,000 francs in France and 2,000,000 lira in Italy." And the verger said, "But God is a Belgian, so it's a local call." And this, please apologize, Madam President, to Senator Critchlow for me. I didn't have his permission, but it is a well-known story, and I see from the response that many of our senators have not appreciated that God is a Barbadian, because he manages to divert all of the serious hurricanes away from Barbados, except for one every 100 years, just to remind us to behave ourselves and to prepare, because the next one is coming up perhaps a little sooner than the 100 years this time. My thoughts, though, about tourism, Madam President, I must mention, because I constantly, in my writings and in my speeches, I promote Barbados as the historic island paradise
with everything. It really does have everything to offer, from history to ecotourism, sports, racing, horse racing, etc. And I was invited. Cheryl Carter of the British Tourism Office was mentioned yesterday, so I don't think I need permission to mention her name again. She commissioned me to write an article for the London's Weekend Telegraph, and I sent them a lovely article which was titled Barbados, the Historic Island Paradise with Everything. And the last paragraph was the one which really wrapped up the everything and the virtues of paradise to bring people back to Barbados. Well, when I saw the publication of the article, they changed the title. It was so unattractive, I don't wonder anyone bothered to read it. And they hadn't used my beautiful color photos of places like the main guard at the garrison, the erection that is a symbol of our UNESCO Historic World Heritage Site. They hadn't used any of my lovely color photos. They had used an old black and white photo of Roebuck Street and a tiny postage stamp photo of a racehorse. And it was so small you really couldn't see it. So this, Madam President, unfortunately, is how sometimes other people see us. But it is a problem to promote our island our island paradise, and we've all got to work at it in these very difficult times. While I'm giving congratulations, I wish to congratulate the Ministry and the Minister of Education for the very clear statement there should be no police in schools. Police in schools seems to give credibility to the issue that school children, or the majority of school children, are violent criminals. They must stay out of it, and the discussions I have had on this subject with senior teachers and principals of schools have made it very clear, although they have been quite silent on the issue, that they do not approve of teachers in schools. They are fully behind the minister, and as my column on Sunday said, so the principals, police, right, they do not approve, pardon, Madam President, they do not approve of police and metal detectors in schools for the obvious reasons, and certainly, as Mr. McFingal said in his column, in the report, it reduces the authority and the power of the principal, and that is hugely important. But, Madam President, what I am missing from the discussion of the school violence and the few criminally oriented students, what I'm missing is the issue of in-service training for the teachers in the skills for managing children who are different children to my generation. The classmate of mine who was either rude to the teacher, who was offensive, who disturbed the class too many times, would be sent by most teachers off to the headmaster. He would be flogged and he would return contrite until at least another 2 weeks, when he seemed to need another flogging again. But that was the power of the principal. That was the way that the teachers could handle it. Except, of course, for the late Sir Alexander Hoyas, who was my history teacher, and he counseled all of the so-called bad boys. And this is what I'm talking about, Madam President, that our teachers need in-service training in dealing with recalcitrant children. And I'm going to say that again, Madam President, because it is critical. Teachers are trained to teach with the assumption that everyone will sit there silently interacting when asked to and will behave perfectly, and that none of them come from broken homes, and that none of them are rebellious. And teachers need in-service training. It cannot all be left to the one school counselor to deal with 1,000 children and resolve their issue. Madam President, I have organized some 50 or 60 continuing medical education conferences, and the Faculty of Medicine at the university is proud of leading the field of professionals in this area of continuing education 20 years before it began to become a buzzword. But it does not appear to have come into the schools in regard to the most critical issue. The teachers need skills in handling children who might be rebellious. It has nothing to do with the subject matter. They need those skills desperately. So just as I said, Senator Sandiford Garner's issue with relation to massive national effort on parenting, we need massive national effort on the skills of the teachers. And it brings me, Madam President, to the issue of tertiary education, because most of our teachers now go through the diploma. and that may give them a smattering of that, but it doesn't give them the full teaching. The other thing that Senator DePisa said that I was very pleased about was in relation to the fact that the university and our other tertiary education institutions need to sit down and have greater partnership with the government in terms of training to suit the needs of the country. This has been one of the signal principles of the successful Lee Kuan Yew's organization for the development of that country. Training tailored to the needs of the country. We produce 1,000 graduates in social sciences every year. And I met a social scientist last year who was working as a welder on the disconnected, taken down, lying on the ground, security tower at Ragged Point Lighthouse, which after 2 years is still lying on the ground. But this social scientist with an upper class degree was working as a welder. Obviously, A, we don't have enough welders, and B, we have too many social scientists because one can only accommodate a certain number. So while, Madam President, I have enormous admiration for the vision, the energy, and the ability to achieve of Sir Hilary Beckles, and for his principle of a graduate in every household, we should modify that principle now. It should be a graduate in every household with a tailored degree to the needs for Barbados development, Madam President. The other person I'd like to congratulate is Senator Watson, because he raised a very important point about the Constitution of the Senate. It is very clear, arithmetic used to be my strong point. I got to advanced maths with the higher calculus, and that stumped me. But arithmetic is really a simple matter. And the Constitution of Barbados provides for a president with 12 government members and 2 opposition. That's 6-1. Now, that is really, in every situation, a walkover, whether it's a football match or whatever, that is a walkover. And it does not allow for the checks and balances that every bicameral legislation in the world assumes will take place. Because even if and when all of the 7 independent members of the Senate were to disagree with a bill, 7 plus 2 is 9, and 9 to 12 is an obvious answer. So, Madam President, when Senator Watson suggested that the Constitution of Barbados would create a more similar and possibly appropriate Westminster model, and he suggested that there should be 4 opposition senators and 10 government senators, it's still 2.5 to 1, and 2.5 to 1 should be a pretty good number. But if there was something that a government in the future decided was absolutely anathema and would create a dictatorship in Barbados, then 4 opposition senators and 7 government senators would have an opportunity of sending something back to the lower house for revision. And Madam President, 2 years ago, I happened to be in Britain over Christmas. And I arrived in Britain the week before Christmas. And every single newspaper in Britain reported on the pension plan of the then Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron. And that pension plan was designed to save the government a considerable sum of money at the expense of the old age pensioners. And what was on the front page was not merely the fact that that pension plan coming through to the House of Lords had been sent back for revision on behalf of the old age pensioners who were going to be punished in a very big way. But the headlines all had a photograph of a member of the House of Lords who had not attended Parliament since the June, but had returned from over and away to go to Parliament to vote in support of the pension plan, which would sacrifice the pensions of the pensioners. And this billionaire member of the House of Lords was highlighted. He was the rogue of the day, the week, and the month, and he was certainly not the Christmas angel that year. And I make the point because when I did my research that year, there had been 3 bills which the House of Lords, in their wisdom, had said they need to be tweaked, to be reviewed, or, as in the case of the pension plan, perhaps this should not go through at all, because the pensioners don't deserve to be treated in that way. And, Madam President, in my 6 years, which will be completed in 5 weeks' time, in my 6 years, there is nothing that this chamber has had the power or the ability, even if it didn't agree with everything in a bill, to have reviewed. And so I strongly support Senator Watson in his recommendation, which he has made public, a view that many people have had, because I've had a similar experience to him over and over again, Madam President. Whether we like it or not, many people across Barbados tell me, but Professor Fraser, the Senate is just a talk shop. You know that it doesn't make a difference. So I congratulate Senator Watson for bringing that to the attention of the public. Where I would have slight disagreement with Senator Watson is on the statement that independent senators are appointed to represent a particular community. I would say not simply to represent, but to contribute from their expertise. Now, when I joined the Senate, when I was appointed, Madam President, 6 years ago, I was appointed to replace an agriculturist who was unwell. And there was in the Senate, sitting 3 chairs from me, another agriculturist. There were 2 agriculturists on the Senate floor. There were none in the House. So that of the 51 members of Parliament at that time, there were 2 agriculturists. So, Madam President, people who haven't got professional expertise often will speak on behalf of agriculture, and Senator Adams, who is an educator, often speaks lucidly and quite passionately and eloquently on the subject of education. My own hats are rather different. I wear multiple hats, and I was told by the Governor General at the time of my appointment that I was being appointed to provide opinions and information and analyses in medicine, in which I've spent 50 years, and in preservation, historic preservation. My other hats do not include agriculture, although when I was 4 years old, Madam President, my mother assigned a garden bed to each of us, and I grew sweet peppers repeatedly. I love the crunchiness of sweet peppers, and I'm told that when anything was done to upset me by my siblings, I would go and water my sweet peppers and perhaps pick the biggest one. So that is perhaps the experience I have in agriculture. I have much more experience with horticulture, and horticulture is an opportunity for many Barbadians. We know a few who make a very, very worthwhile living out of a plantation which might otherwise be growing grass through horticulture and the horticultural industry. But I cannot add much on agriculture. I can add on culture and fine art and on heritage tourism. I had 4.5 years of chairing the Tourism Advisory Committee. Madam President, I have actually committed so much of my waking life to public service, serving on a total, I think, of 8 committees, commissions, and boards and task forces, that my wife would be entitled to sue for divorce in the cause of desertion. I have spent, I guess, almost as much pro bono time on these boards and committees as I have in the hospital and the university, and therefore I do wear a lot of hats. But in my discussion of the estimates, I will restrict myself to the heads in the areas that I do have some personal experience. Now, Madam President, the 2012-2013 document, which is even bulkier and weighs slightly more than the 2018-2019 document, and senators can see the difference in the thickness. It's been an interesting comparison looking at my first estimates and looking at these estimates 7 years later. It's been an absolutely fascinating comparison, because I really realize that although the numbers in the last 3 numbers in a multi-million-dollar or $100,000 budget line item might have changed by $20 or $200 or occasionally $20,000, it really is essentially almost the same estimates that we had 7 years ago. There's not been a lot of change. So it's interesting that I will be making some of the same recommendations that I made then. I was struck, I added up the utility uses by all of the government departments, and I could not believe utility bills in the 6 digits, 5 digits by departments, and I wondered what they did with all that electricity, water, and telephone bills. This is something that I felt at the time should be monitored in some way, and I can only say that the electricity bills have, by and large, actually gone up. And that disappoints me because we talk constantly about saving government funds through efficiencies, and that is an area where I'm sure there can be efficiencies. I know that government has a program for putting solar systems in place which should greatly reduce the electricity costs. That does not appear to be expressed in the estimates unless in some way it's expressed in the utilities bill itself. And on that score, Madam President, let me comment on Senator Haynes's concern about the drop in the HIV/AIDS budget. I did a little research on that myself, and I discovered that what happened is that the laboratory supplies had previously been included under HIV/AIDS itself. And on this occasion, those costs have been moved to the total Health Ministry's laboratory costs, which you will see is one of the biggest changes that has gone up significantly. So the major concern is not due to drop in HIV/AIDS, it's not due to a drop in testing, it's not due to abandonment of patients without drugs, it's not due to efficiency savings, it is simply due to a technical removal of that aspect of the HIV/AIDS budget into the laboratory costs. And that, Madam President, is obviously, to me, something that requires an explanatory note. And I was struck that on this occasion, the explanatory notes, particularly for the heads I looked at, such as health, were absolutely absent. All of the explanatory notes which were referred to simply repeated the line at the top of the page for that particular head. And Madam President, I hope this point might be transmitted to those preparing the document in future. It may be why the document is thinner this year. I can't see any other reason clearly why it's thinner, but the explanatory heads should be there so that we can interpret what we're reading. Now, Madam President, I want to move on to the broader areas. More than a decade ago, Sir George Alleyne chaired a health commission in Nassau, Bahamas, which resulted in the famous Nassau Declaration. And in that Nassau Declaration, the byword was, the health of the nation is the wealth of the nation. The health of the nation is the wealth of the nation. And Sir George visited all of the Caribbean territories to personally promote the recommendations of this non-communicable disease commission and the Nassau Declaration to support it, to support the activities and to support the Conference of the Heads of Government, which was held a little later in Trinidad, where the heads of government committed to increasing budgets for health, to increasing health promotion, and to preventing as much as possible of the chronic diseases. And Madam President, that was a unanimously, strongly supported mission of the heads of governments following the Nassau Declaration to improve the health of the people, to improve the health promotion, and to try to prevent the chronic diseases. Well, Madam President, when I look at our health budget, both on average over the years from 2012 and the current estimates, it's 7% of our budget. Now, Madam President, we have a very small cake and an awful lot of people who want to eat from it. And when half of the cake appears to be gone, you can serve even less people, or you can just serve them crumbs. But I looked, with my own research on the estimates, I looked on the web and I found that in Britain, the last completed assessed year for Britain was actually 2016. 17% of the budget was spent on health. 17% of Britain's budget was spent on health, which is 2.5 times the proportion of ours. And then I looked at Canada, and Madam President, I nearly had a stroke, because in Canada, it ranges from 34% of the budget to 43%. In the province of Quebec, it's 34%, and in Ontario, it's 43%. These are actually extraordinary figures, but they do support the view that the health of the nation is the wealth of the nation. And it's obvious that in those countries, there are other things that we undertake that must be undertaken in many other ways. For example, there's a hugely well-financed, profitable pair of preservation organizations and the National Trust itself. There are 3 organizations, one of which is a partnership, 2 of which are entirely philanthropic. And so we don't have that kind of thing, and we obviously have to do a lot more with our cake. But I wish to comment on the fact that we only have 7% of our budget on health. It is far less than education, and in many countries, it's the other way around. In Britain, the health budget is much bigger actually than education, which may be why the British are complaining about their education at the moment. But our health budget, which went as high as 415 million in 2012-13, when the QEH had 212 million, after a period of drought, the QEH was given a bigger budget. And at that time, it was 415 million in all, and half of it went to the QEH. Now, the average spend over the years 2010 to 2017, the average spend on health has actually been 357 million. 357 million per annum. And these current estimates take it down by 8% to 329 million. And I do know that on several occasions, people say the supplementaries will expand the budget for health. But when I look through the 7 years, the difference between the initial estimates and the revised estimates for health are not often significant. So, Madam President, what I'm saying is that our health budget has gone down over 7 years when it should have gone up. Our QEH spending was 162 million to 212 million over those years, with an average of 170 million for the QEH over the years. Now, in my many meetings over the years with the hospital directorate, and with ministries of health, it has been acknowledged that the QEH budget from the turn of the century should have been in the region of $190 million. We have been under budgeted from way back, from the first oil crisis, way back in 1973, dramatically when the budget remained much the same for several years in the early 1990s, and the difference between the budget's increase for the hospital over the period when it was increasing and the cost of living was dramatic. And Madam President, it was sad to say that when the board took over, it was given a loan of 25 million, which it had to pay back. And that 25 million was really a drop in the ocean of the under-budgeting of the QEH. And so, with a current estimate of 149 million, compared to the average over those 7 years in which it has been going steadily down, it's a drop from the average of 12% in the QEH. Now, I know that the current director has been begging everyone in the hospital to increase efficiency and to improve the efficiency costs. That, as we've seen from the utilities bill, is very difficult to do. But I suspect that a great deal of the reason why the consequence, of course, of a low estimate is low spending. And part of the reason for low spending is because of the shortage of nurses. And, Madam President, I wish to use this opportunity to give amazing, firm affirmation of the work done by the healthcare team in the hospital. I have worked for almost all of my professional life, 30-odd years in the hospital, and I want to say 3 things. The developments of the hospital to provide specialty care in every specialty area you can think of has been led by an individual doctor, Professor Sir Errol Walron, Dr. Charlie Edwards in gastroenterology, myself in hypertension, Professor Sir Trevor Hassel in cardiology, aided and abetted by Dr. Richard Ishmael, GCM. All of these developments in medicine have been led not by administrators at the top, whose role appeared always to be simply to save money, but led by individual, passionate, patriotic Barbadians like myself, who came home to develop a specialty for the people of Barbados. And I give enormous credit to those doctors. And then to the nurses, Madam President, when we have had nursing shortages because people did not appreciate that we were running ever since the foundation of the hospital with too few nurses. They increased the nursing aliquot at the Barbados Community College from something like 15 to 20 per year to 60 per year. 60 per year. Now that was the effort of Sir Branford Tate. And I wish to give credit to Sir Branford Tate, who is one of my political heroes, because he demonstrated a tremendous will to get the best answers and to work with the people who knew what they were doing. And Sir Branford worked with Professor Sir Errol Walrond and myself in many areas of development of the hospital. In fact, it would not be amiss to say, because it was generally known, Sir Branford had a back problem. Sir Branford found himself on the massage table and the operating table, as it were, of the physiotherapists in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And the physiotherapist was able to tell him that the passionate advocate for rehab and physiotherapy was Professor Fraser. And I was made, within days, I was made head of an almost non-existent rehabilitation department in order to develop it. And the first thing I did was to ask for expertise. I asked a brilliant Jamaican physiatrist, rehabilitation therapist physician, a Dr. Watson, to come down from New York. She led a huge rehab team in New York. She knew what she was doing. She spent a week with us. She wrote a 6-page report, which allowed me to get for the hospital 2 additional physiotherapist posts, some additional equipment, the agreement to have a physiatrist heading that department, and that took some years. And there was one other thing, occupational therapy. We finally got occupational therapy well established, but we finally got a physiatrist. So, you know, it was a question of Sir Branford recognizing a need because of a personal experience, finding somebody who was passionate. I call myself a PP and a PPP. That is a passionate patriarch and a pen and paper person. And Sir Branford therefore got the expertise available in the hospital, and I got the expertise that I knew of, and that expertise came in, and so we have a decent rehab therapy. We have a reasonable rehab therapy. It still needs a lot more support, because rehabilitation is far more important than the average doctor or the average public person recognizes. It needs more support. So that's the second point. To finish with the nursing scheme, Madam President, what has happened, people may wonder why we're still short of nurses. Previous governments have imported nurses from other places. Their contracts have not been permanent contracts, and they have now all departed with the expectation that the community college increased graduating class would fill all of our posts. Well, it has not, because we now have a regional exam which those nurses have to take. And it suggests that the regional exam is much, much stiffer, and our nurses have been passing the local exam and not passing the regional exam, so that when 50 or 60 nurses are expected to come through to the hospital, they don't come. Finally, on the nursing point, Madam President, the nursing complement of the hospital has never been increased in 60+ years. Now, when I joined the hospital in 1977, there were 16 consultants. Today, there are many more, because we have every single subspecialty, and in some areas, like cancer, we have 2, gastroenterology, we have 2. So we have perhaps 50 consultants or more. And the work associated requires nurses. Madam President, may I give you a concept of the role of the nurse and the doctor in the hospital? I see the hospital team, which is a large team, as an old-fashioned bicycle wheel. I see the patient at the center of the wheel, the hub. And those of us who rode bicycles in our youth will recall that the spokes all came in to either side of that hub. The strength of the wheel was the spokes coming into either side of that hub. So that hub is really the patient. And on one side you have the doctor, and on the other side you have the nurse. It is teamwork. It is magnificent partnership. One cannot work without the other. The spokes radiate to all the other departments. They include radiology, they include the laboratory, they include physiotherapy, they include the kitchen, because the food is the biggest complaint about all hospitals. So the kitchen is an important part of those spokes. But that's the point, Madam President, nurses and doctors with the patient in between. And our hospital, remarkably, has never been able to persuade the administration that we need more nurses. So periodically, when there were imported nurses filling the posts, we have been told the nursing complement is full. There's no shortage of nurses. But yet an emergency ward would have a single staff nurse and one assistant nurse with 24 patients coming and going, some of them in extremis. And those are the conditions, Madam President, that our doctors have had to work under, that our nurses have had to work under. Forgive me, but it does make me emotional, because I have seen the suffering, Madam President. I have seen the loss of life. I have seen the stress among the nurses and the doctors. Madam President, when I was an intern, after 1 month of my internship, I was told by the hospital administration that we interns would have to man the emergency department, unsupervised. We were only provisionally registered. We had never worked in emergency departments before. And the one registrar, the one middle grade doctor in charge of that department, which had no consultant, lived in St. Philip. Madam President, we were absolute novices, and Senator Haynes will confirm that. We were in extremis in that situation, dealing with patients in extremis at 3 o'clock in the morning without help, and we had to make those decisions. The junior doctors on the wards were called to help us, their registrars, etc. But for many of us, it was a terrible situation. And that kind of situation, in spite of Britain having a 17% health budget, that situation in Britain is currently under intense emotional discussion, because doctors are leaving the health service in Britain because of the inadequate conditions, because of the pressures they're under, because of the loss of life. And I could recommend, Madam President, for reading by all of us, a book called This Is Going to Hurt, about the story of one such doctor who went through such training, who missed every anniversary, birthday of his child, birthday of his wife, everything, and he finally gave up after 12 years in medicine because of their conditions at 17% of the health budget. So, Madam President, I make a plea. The health of the nation is the wealth of the nation, and we are not recognizing the dictum of the most brilliant doctor we've produced, Sir George Alleyne. The health of the nation is the wealth of the nation. Madam President, the last point on QEH relates to the issue of nurses and records. The last point is the records. The records department at QEH has been as long suffering as the nurses. We have had records multiplying like viruses. We have had inadequate storage. When I've gone for old records of a patient who has been in the hospital in the 60s or 70s, I have had to search among dusty piles in the basement, littered with the litter left by the rodents and the vermin in the basement. The people, the staff of the records department have to climb up on ladders and fight to get notes in and out of shelves. And the problem for the patient then is that quite often in the outpatients especially, there are no notes. And if the notes can't be found, there's a real problem, because there's no record. Nobody knows what has happened. The doctors may have changed. Even the doctor who knows the patient can't remember everything. So there is enormous delay, enormous suffering, and I venture to say, enormous increase in illness and possibly death because of our record system. Not enough staff, not enough space. And it is more than 30 years which we have discussed electronic medical records at the hospital. The EMR is something that was led by Mr. Paul Edis-Paho more than 30 years ago, and every 5 years the project gets resuscitated. Now, while I'm saying this is amusing and tragic, I would also congratulate the hospital for its achievement with relation to laboratory data, because we now have electronic storage and sharing of the laboratory data and the radiology results. That, Madam President, is a magnificent achievement. And congratulations to everyone involved. That is the great achievement of our hospital. It means that the doctor now knows the results, and he and the nurses do not have to be running around the hospital trying to chase results and wasting their time acting as messengers. Messengers are important, but after all, if the doctor has to become a messenger, then where's the doctor? So these are issues that are very important, and I congratulate the achievement of online laboratory and radiology services, but it is not yet online with the polyclinics. So the patient who gets discharged with an outstanding result, then the polyclinic doctor still cannot get it, as far as I understand, and I hope I'm wrong. But this is an area of enormous importance, Madam President. Electronic medical records. 35 years of a lot of long talk, and we've only achieved it with the investigation results. Now, I have heard it, I have seen it, I have read it in the press, that it is now under discussion again. I wonder whether there's a philanthropist who's doing it, because I don't see anything in the estimates for it. There's no line item, and there's no increase of any of the line items that I have looked for to see where the millions of dollars for EMR, for patient notes would be. I have visited hospitals. I've visited so many hospitals in the world. Every time I have an opportunity, I go to a hospital, and I've sat at outpatient desks with colleagues and looked at the EMR situation on their computers. And it is wonderful, because my friends in Washington and other places have shown me what they prescribed at the last visit, what the laboratory results were on any patient that they pull up. So EMR is a huge issue, and as I said, it's been on our wish list since the early 80s with PAHO, promising to get it done for us. We've gone through many iterations, and it hasn't happened. But of course, it has to be done right. The British had a collapse and a crash because their system wasn't right. They wouldn't do, and in this respect, we're like them, they wouldn't adopt a really successful long-term American system. They had to invent their own, and it crashed. It cost them millions of dollars and millions of inconveniences because they'd had to do their own rather than use the American. So we are in danger of creating more problems than we solve if we do go about it the wrong way, and I wish everyone... Thank you, Madam President. Briefly, the drug service, Madam. Madam President, when I came home, I brought with me the principles of WHO and PAHO on essential drug use and on cost-effective drug use. And I worked across the Caribbean and with WHO PAHO to promote the concept of the national formulary with a limited number of essential drugs, and then with the drug service and with the regional drug testing laboratory, so that generic drugs from accredited companies could be chosen from the range that might have been offered, and that drug testing for quality could be carried out both at the regional drug lab, where I sat on the board in Jamaica, and where necessary in drug testing laboratories in Canada. And so we have worked very hard to provide the best essential drugs for Barbados over many, many years. But Madam President, I was reminded when I looked back at the 2012-2010 document, sorry, 2010-11 document, to note that the drug costs had reached $47 million. That was quite extraordinary, and we were in trouble by that time. As you will recall, our economic situation wasn't good. And I was called out of retirement. I had been on summer vacation. It was just my last months of work. And I was called out with a request from the drug service to make a video explaining to the people of Barbados. And that video told the story of the fact that a company which initiates, researches, and produces the first drug and patents it can charge from 5 to 10 to 20 times as much as a company making it on what is called a generic basis 20 years later when the patent is gone. So drug X might cost $20 a tablet when it's first sold by the innovator company, and it might be able to be bought for 25 cents a tablet by one of the accredited generic companies, and if in doubt, it can be tested. And I made a video to explain that, and Madam President, the next year, the estimate said you can get $23 million. Well, they may have gone a bit overboard, And that year, I think, in 2012, was the year that there were a lot of protests, and I recall being told that there were actually 75 drugs out of stock at the QEH at that time. There was a significant drop, there was a problem, and it must have balanced out. The next year was 24 million, and in 2013-14, the revised estimates were 12 million, and for the next few years, it's been 12 million. So we've had 5 years of spending $12 million in drugs, as opposed to 47 million. And that, I think, would be a good example of efficiency savings, which we talk about so much. It was efficiency savings based on logic, science, and practicalities. I am worried, however, that it has gone too far, because while there are not as many as 75 out-of-stock drugs at the QEH right now, there are repeated, regular out-of-stocks, both at QEH and the polyclinics. And out-of-stock drugs can be devastating for patients, because a patient who has severe hypertension doesn't get their drug that week, a stroke is on the cards, very much so. Madam President, health promotion. Now, this is where people have said to me that this is a talk shop, and I have to agree, because health promotion was one of the big messages of Sir George Alleyne, of the Chronic Disease Commission. Health of the nation is the wealth of the nation. Improve health promotion. And it doesn't just mean an article in the newspaper. It means intensive interaction at schools, at community centers, on the television, on the radio, GIS, which is underutilized. All these opportunities for health promotion are simply not being kept. We increased our health promotion budget. Amazingly, one year it suddenly jumped from 500 to 900,000, and then it's fallen steadily down. We put 400,000 in the estimates every year, and we spend 300,000 in the estimates on health promotion. I wrote a proposal for health promotion many years ago, and I got a second health promotion officer. So we now have 2 officers. That's 100% increase from 1 to 2. And there's no operating expenses of any consequence. So health promotion is being ignored. Now, I know we need partnerships, and most of the health promotion is actually done by the Diabetes Foundation and such like. And then the issue of dental care, Madam President. I'm one of those people who has been a dental delight. That's what my dentists have always told me, because I give them such challenging jobs. I get dental abscesses in spite of dental care at home. I get dental abscesses, I have to have teeth filled and extracted, I've had implants, I've had the lot. I am a dental delight, and I've suffered horrendous pain. But being a physician, I can at least treat my pain fairly quickly. The man in the street cannot go and get 30 milligrams of codeine just like that. He has to go to the doctor or the dentist and have the tooth pulled out. So what happens in Barbados, where there is no assistance, there is no partnership with the dentists, and we spend less than $2 million a year in dental care compared to $357 million in overall health care. That's less than 1%, less than 0.5% for dental care, and the teeth are a very important part of the body. So, you know, we could go into the debate of which organ is the most important, but we have been ignoring our teeth and the suffering that goes with it, because, Madam President, there is literally nothing worse than toothache except perhaps severe labor pains. And toothache will drive people crazy, for pain is perfect misery, as Milton said. And it's that pain which takes people off the job, which reduces productivity, all because we will not employ a few more dentists, and we will not facilitate the private care. Because as my friend, and I have his permission to say this, as my friend Dr. Eastman, who is the archangel of dental education and dental management in Barbados, Dr. Eastman keeps pointing out that if only the high cost of dental equipment for the few dentists we have less than 100 dentists. If the high cost of dental equipment could be facilitated by some sort of duty concession, then perhaps more private care could be done, and there would be a huge increase in productivity. Madam President, the elderly. I was delighted when Senator Durant told me yesterday that his church will be developing a daycare center for the elderly, because the government has spent $42 million in geriatric care in 2011-12, and it's down to $35 million, which is almost a 20% drop in the care of the elderly. Now, Madam President, the Caribbean Health Research Council commissioned me in 1982 to do a study of the elderly, the needs of the elderly, and the need for research in elderly care. And what we showed, I'll just give you one fact. Barbados had by far the highest percent, 50% more elderly patients than any other Caribbean country. We were at that time up around 10%, and it has increased significantly of the elderly over 65, and other Caribbean countries were between 3 and 6%. We were up there. It was one of the areas of shining. And why? Because in that era of 1982, all the middle-aged people who would normally be caring for the elderly weren't there. So we didn't have a population pyramid shaped like this. We had an hourglass pyramid. The caregivers in middle age just didn't live in Barbados. Now they've come back as elderly. The returnees are over 65. So we now have a huge spreading tree of elderly patients with a population over 65 that is well into the teens, and our care of the elderly has dropped by almost 20%. Daycare centers are the answer, Madam President, and I know that Senator Duran is now going to lead that charge that I have been preaching for 6 years in the Senate, and I invite everyone, I've been told I can do this, to visit the St. Barnabas Daycare Center, the model of private care, which takes a huge load off the government. It's a matter of partnership, Madam President, and partnership between government and the churches is key. A brief word on research, because the Chronic Disease Research Center is now the gold star of the university, and the government has partnered with the university in that regard. And I want to emphasize that word partnership, because the research center is a magnificent example of the success of partnership. My last point, Madam President, is really a brief word on the social, the recovery plan, the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018. As Madam President and other senators will recall, and as Hansard will note, I have been calling for the resuscitation of the social partnership for 6 years. And I was finally relieved when it happened. But Madam President, you know, a policy by definition is a principle of action adopted by government, etc., and the basic principles by which government is guided. A plan is a detailed proposal for doing something, and this is therefore an excellent policy document, but it would need, I think, another 5 years to create the plan to make it work. And the interpretation of the document, therefore, is rather interesting, because I am fully on board with some of the things that have been said, some of the things that have not happened, and all I can say is that I wish this policy document had been put before the Senate 5 years ago, because it is hugely comprehensive, and it is so long that very few people will read it, and the implementation is a whole nother ballgame, because it's much like mother's milk. And most of the things in here we've been calling for 5 years. With that said, I congratulate the Ministry of Finance and their staff on producing it, and I therefore support this appropriation bill. We wouldn't want the government to shut down, as it would happen in the States if we didn't support it, so it has my support. Thank you, Madam President.